This is a summary of Joseph Butler's sermon number 11 entitled Upon the Love of Our Neighbor. And it begins with a Bible verse from Romans chapter 13, verse 9, which says, "And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So the purpose of this sermon is to show that self-love is compatible with benevolence, or that self-love is compatible with loving thy neighbor. And so first he wants to tell us what self-love is. So he explores the nature of self-love and describes it as an affection like any other we have. Except for this affection is general in nature. It's about the desire we have for our own happiness. And so the object of it is internal to us. It's our own happiness. Whereas the other affections are outwardly oriented. It's outwardly focused. And the objects are external things in the world. Butler wants us to make a distinction between external things out there and the pleasures that we might derive from acquiring them. So he says, quote in section 6, that there could not be this pleasure were it not for that prior suitableness between the object and the passion. And so for him, it's important to understand our nature and this fit with nature in our desires. David McNaughton, the commentator here, describes this as a desire-dependent pleasure. And so this fit with the external world describes this way that our desires match up to the world and have this, as he calls it, suitableness to it. This distinction is important because we might be tempted to reduce everything in life to just pleasure seeking. And Butler thinks that that's wrong. In answer to the hedonist who would say that that's the case. Butler thinks this is wrong because that's just not the way we speak. So in the next paragraph, this is paragraph 7, he says, we talk like as if we do things not only for our own sake or for our own advantage, but also for the sake of others or for the good of others. And if that's true, then it can't just be, pleasure can't be the only motivating principle. And so he's got this picture that we have self-love as an affection, but we also have these other affections and appetites as well working alongside that, or in some cases subservient to self-love. But self-love can't be the whole picture if this is true. In section 9, he goes on to describe that self-love must be moderate if it's not to be selfish and lead us to unhappiness. So here he describes two paradoxes. One is that if we are preoccupied with self-love, this might make our own happiness impossible. So that's one. And the second is that on the other side, self-love ought to make us more focused on, less focused on ourselves. So we're more concerned with these other affections that we have. We might be concerned with the good of others if we are truly attentive to our self-love. In section 10, he transitions to another question. He asks, is there a tension between these two, self-love on the one hand and benevolence on the other? He's concerned with whether there is an essential conflict with them as affections. So do the affections themselves involve some sort of contradictory understanding of things? And so he says that if you examine the ideas of each one, benevolence on the one hand and self-love on the other, if you examine them closely, there's no logical contradiction between them. For example, when we think about self-love, we don't think about, it doesn't necessarily follow that we are only concerned with the self, that it's love of self and against any concern of love for the other. And when we think about the idea of loving thy neighbor, we don't think about in exclusion to loving oneself. So just in the concepts themselves or in the affections themselves, there's no conflict. At the bottom of the page in section 12, he moves on to consider an additional question, whether there's any competition between these two in terms of the private and public goods that they produce. So in other words, is there a tension between pursuing public goods and in pursuing private goods? And he says that there's no more tension here than there is between any of the other affections that we find in ourselves. So there's always going to be this potential for conflict between our appetites and our affections. But just because one affection is oriented towards others, the good of others, and one is oriented towards the good of ourselves, it doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be a conflict here any more than there will be in terms of any of the other ones of acquiring any of the goods um, of any of the objects that they're aimed at. In fact, he says that benevolent people, this is section 14, benevolent people are quite happy. They seem to be, even in many cases, happier than people who are really self-oriented in the sense of being selfish. And he gives an example of that. So he says that happiness is to fulfill all of one's appetites, and it's about happiness consists, he says in section 16, quote, happiness consists in the gratification of certain affections, appetites, passions, and objects which are by nature adapted to them. So he says self-love may indeed set us on work to gratify these, but happiness or enjoyment has no immediate connection to self-love, but arises from such gratifications alone. Love of our neighbor is one of those affections. So in order to be happy, we also have to be, to get happiness for ourselves, we also have to be concerned about our neighbors. And that's not concerned about our neighbors. Keep in mind, it's not concerned about our neighbors for the sake of our own self, right? In one sense it is, but this is where that maybe a paradox is in play. But in order to truly be happy, you have to actually want the good and desire the good and be happy when another person is happy. So if that makes sense. He considers a few other questions closing out the chapter here. That he wants to say there's a confusion based in the comparison between being happy and owning stuff. So there's an objection or concern that's raised that just like when you own property and you're generous with it, being generous with it entails losing stuff yourself. And so isn't it the same with happiness or concern for others, that when you try to make other people happy, that you're going to be less happy yourself because there's less of it to go around for yourself? And he says that's not the case here. Yes, you have to sacrifice. He says you don't have to sacrifice happiness, and in fact, you might, after caring for others or making other people feel good, you might even feel better yourself. He then wraps up the sermon with a few points on religion, saying that religion promotes both self-love and benevolence. And he gives the example of Jesus, who commands us to be benevolent and lives out an example of that for us as well. I hope that's helpful.